Whakarofato, good evening, Pomarie. Just so wonderful to be with you tonight. It's one of those really good things that we've started to do. As you know, we have just had a few of these live nights, and so far the reaction has been wonderful. And and I really am grateful to everyone who has been coming in and watching in. It really is a time where we can bring people in to speak so that you, our people out there, are able to be more well educated and be able to hear from the people themselves without the partisan media and partisan journalists actually engaging and trying to trap people and get into what's it, who done it. So we want to get the experts, those who are in the field. It's really powerful. We've got some exciting lineups coming along as well. So good evening to you all who are coming on in. And without further ado, I want to introduce you to our guest. He is powerful. I'm pretty excited. I'm a little bit intimidated because he's pretty awesome. He is a social and political entrepreneur. He is, in fact, the co-founder of the Taxpayers Union. He is the co-founder of the Free Speech Coalition. He's awesome. So I want to, without further ado, introduce you to Jordan Williams. Hey, woo! Jordan, so glad you could be with us. Thank you so much for
After that build
having
up,
a
when
chat
you
with
said
us.
my name, it would have disappointed a lot of your viewers, but good to be with you, Elliot.
Oh man, I doubt that. I doubt that a lot. So, first and foremost, I would love for you just to have a quick chat about who you are and just maybe about something about the organizations that you've actually helped build, and it's been so powerful. So please spend a bit of time who you are and just those organizations that you run.
Well, you're very kind. Background, I'm a commercial constitutional lawyer, although I did do a lot of work around competition law and regulatory, economic, boring stuff around electricity and the like. Became very interested in politics. Originally fronted a group against the retention of MMP. Think that the problem with MMP is it's great on the representation, not so great on the accountability side. That obviously didn't go through, and coming up 8 years ago, founded a group called the New Zealand Taxpayers Union. We stand for lower taxes, less waste, more transparency, and have about 69,000 subscribed members and supporters. A lot of people will be familiar with some of our work in Auckland by our group up there, our subsidiary organisation called the Auckland Ratepayers Alliance, fronted by a wonderful spokeswoman, Jo Holmes. And then more recently, as a result of Phil Goff wanting to decide who we can hear from and who we can't, pulled a group together called the Free Speech Coalition. And we are actually currently waiting on a court judgment from the Court of Appeal on Phil Goff when he announced that he was banning some Canadian speakers. In actual fact, he'd lied. They then come up with all these health and safety reasons, but that's wandering through the courts. I mean, we think that actually it's really overdue for a group to be standing up for free speech in New Zealand, particularly around the universities, and being able to hear from people that are controversial. A lot of the, in fact, I'm fair to say, actually, most of the people we stand up for, not everyone agrees with within the organisation. But the thing is, you only actually stand for free speech if you're willing to stand for the people you don't agree with, and that's the point the organisation makes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Now, I also understand that even more importantly, you're actually a new father. Is that correct?
I sure am, and as we've discussed, if I have to take off suddenly, that's because Zoe's woken up, and I'm on daddy duty tonight. It's one of the very few. She's 11 months today, and it's actually one of the few nights where Em's taken off out for dinner. So fair enough that that this should be how appropriate if I have to duck off if she does wake up. But fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. No worries. And
yeah.
and that's actually quite right, people. So we were discussing this today. So he's not Jordan is not babysitting. He's daddying. Daddying. So, woo, of course, we're not allowed to call it babysitting.
I think we've both got in trouble for using that term with
I think we
with our wives.
Woo, pretty much. So let's get stuck in now. I've been explaining, and for all of you out there, now I am a layman. I mean, my stuff is in youth field. You give me a young mind, and I'll explain the neurological and psychological aspects of pathways. You start talking economics to me, and I'll go, oh, yep, yeah, oh. So, but economics really does underpin the very ability to decide what we do with our lives. It's incredibly strong and so important. And the Taxpayers Union has been at the head of actually exposing a lot of the things that are going on in government that cause us great deals of pain. And it's only when you guys have actually brought it up that we have realized what's going on. Things like the slide and the wastage by Mr. Peters and Shane Jones. And I have to say, your team have been marvelous. Now, let's get stuck into sort of like the big stuff first and foremost. As we know, the latest coronavirus, which has been named COVID-19, has done pretty much a number on economies around the world. What is your reaction in terms of how the New Zealand government has dealt with the COVID situation in New Zealand first, and then if you'd like to, we can also, or you can spread out into what's happening in terms of the other nations and how that's happening and what's going on. So what's actually going on in terms of our economy and others' economies? What can you tell us what's going on?
Well, the first thing is the natural reaction, of course, is to shut down. But even if you're not, and I not very keen to get into the sort of merits or not, New Zealand's on a reasonably unique path because, rightly or wrongly, we've gone down this elimination path. I think it's fair to say that in 12 or 24 months' time, it will become clear whether New Zealand is either the smartest country in the world or the dumbest. And I'm actually not sure on that. I think one of the great things about New Zealand is that when the decision was made, particularly in that first lockdown, I mean, even and I don't have a lot of time for the current Prime Minister, but even I wanted her to succeed. And we look around the world, the way there's a lot more polarization in politics, and the way that actually whether you're a Republican or Democrat is so much about not just your worldview, but who you're friends with and all that sort of thing. And that polarization, one of the great things about New Zealand is even if we disagreed with it, the compliance was really high. And you can't do that with the police or people, and as Melbourne's finding out, you do that when you've got strong social cohesion. And that, I think, is one of the things that makes New Zealand really remarkable. Coming from what the economic response should be, we've done really what the rest of the world has done in that we've opened up the purse strings and let the money flow out. And even us on the weird centre right on the economic spectrum, even we published a paper very early on, in fact, before the lockdown, on that was then we were calling it the corona virus rather than it had lots of, it wasn't COVID yet, wasn't the word, but even we said actually we're fiscal conservatives. We believe in running the books well in terms of low debt and an efficient, smart government for the rainy day, and the rainy day has arrived. Now that I think was right. The trouble is, right now, because of the 30 years of fiscal conservatism of both National and Labor governments actually running reasonably tight ships, the floor on that consensus has now disappeared. And actually, we're in free fall. That although there is absolutely justifiable reason that, yep, we have to increase borrowing, and yep, we should be softening the blow. That seems to be the word that the Labor Party want to use. Actually, things are now just getting out of control. And around that, the real, I think it's one of two of the largest public policy questions possibly of our lifetime, one being the merits of the relative merits of the lockdown. The other is actually what the Reserve Bank's doing, because basically we've got a lot of talk around And I know we want to get me onto quantitative easing and all of that, and whether that's just printing money. Effectively, what's happening is the government goes out to the market. It is. I'll put these in perspective first. So the total size of the New Zealand economy is, give or take, about 314 billion. So 314,000 million. That's what New Zealand produces per year. Of that, about 90 billion, so 314, about 90 billion over the last few years is, give or take, how much the core government spends. I'm not talking about SOEs, I'm not talking about local councils, state enterprises like SOEs, I'm not talking about councils, but in terms of core government on education, police, justice, etc. Now you've got that in perspective. What we have now is the government, one, increasing that, two, the tax coming in dramatically reducing, and that's what we talk about when the came out today about this decade of deficits, of spending more than they're bringing in. And what the government goes out to do, and it goes out to the market and issues bonds, which is just borrowing money. It's just a promise to pay in the future. But instead of, as would happen in the normal, is the market saying, well, actually, you're looking a bit more risky and we don't know what the future holds. We're going to charge you a bit more. We're going to require a higher interest rate. We're going to require a bit more money in 5 years' time than we otherwise normally would. Instead, what's happening is our Reserve Bank is then buying up those government bonds, not directly from the government, there's a third party there, but buying it back from the banks. And what they're doing is artificially bringing that interest rate down. So when they talk about the stimulus and bringing down the interest rates or quantitative easing, that's what they're talking about. And that is the printing of the money, because the Reserve Bank is buying these bonds but increasing the amount of cash in circulation. Now, the risk of that, of course, is inflation, and that's one of the big mysteries, is that we're not seeing inflation in terms of everyday goods like we did in the 70s. Where we are is around asset prices and housing being a great example. In stocks, how on earth, the biggest economic crises of our lifetime, is the stock market still worth effectively what it was 12 months ago? That you have on the news a couple of nights ago, it had about house prices are still increasing. Well, hang on, the story shouldn't be this is great, house prices are still increasing. Surely the story should be what on earth is going wrong here that house prices are still increasing at the same time as we're learning that 250,000 New Zealanders are going to be receiving the dole over the next few years. This is extraordinary. But to just put it in perspective, I want to circle back round. 314 billion, the size of the economy. Government spending per year is about 90 billion, but although they'll be higher now. But the Reserve Bank is committed to printing up to $100 billion of new money. And so that the economists around the world, and everyone's doing it, the Fed, and the idea is that of course the worry is our dollar becomes worthless, but the idea is if everyone's doing it, is it such of a problem? But it's a hell of a risk, and we've never, where we end up here is the enormous unknown. But those are the things that are keeping me awake at night at the moment. And you mentioned some of the work we do around exposing the government department that bought hair straighteners for the staff and stuff. That's the sort of lower end. This is very much down the other end of the sort of macro things that are very much in mind from a taxpayer perspective.
So I want to just jump in there. So, right, $314 billion is roughly our GDP. $90 billion is how much the government is spending. And of course, it's probably more now, as you said. Now, I'm a layman. To me, taking approximately a third of the GDP in New Zealand seems pretty high to me. Now, am I wrong in thinking that, or should we expect that very roughly a third of the GDP of a country should be going to government spending?
Well, I wish it was just that. The best like-for-like measure is the OECD figures, and they measure it on the total amount of total government outlays. So they include the state-owned enterprises, businesses owned by governments around the world, because often these are used as just another way of tax. For a small example, Transpower, the electricity transmission between regions, the big lines. Now, a lot of governments own those around the world, but they can use them as a sort of another way to tax. We don't, the way that we regulate it. So the way the OECD come at it is, okay, what is the total proportion of the economy that is spent by the broader government, not just the core crown? Now that in New Zealand is 41%. And that is not the largest in the OECD, but it's certainly not. In fact, I think I'm pretty confident it's not even in the bottom half. But there's a general correlation between the long-term economic prosperity of a country and the size of the state. Now, our friends in Australia are significantly lower than us, of course, even though they have federal, state, and local government. You know, as a proportion of the economy, it's smaller. Under Bill English, basically by growing government just a little bit slower over the long term, he actually brought it down. Half of the difference, though, was made up by the growth in local government, which is something I'm sure a lot of new Conservative members share our annoyance with local government, particularly Auckland Council. But I mean, that's that I think is the best apples for apples way to measure it. And it effectively means that you get up in the morning, you go to work, and it's not until late May, early April that you're working for yourself. And that's that's fundamentally the reason why I'm a fiscal conservative, is that, you know, you look at example after example around the world, you need strong institutions, you know, lack of corruption, etc. But also the size of the state matters. You know, we're not, you know, there's some people in our movement that believe in next to no government, or government small enough that you can drown in a bath. We're not there. And you know, reasonable minds can differ on what that is, but we'd certainly argue that right now there are a lot of things government does that it doesn't need to be doing. And I put, for even just the last few days, these 120 businesses that get a handout for the government because they're in the tourism sector, while there's another 300 that applied, not to mention the ones that didn't know that they could apply, that don't get any grants. This sort of strange allocation of capital based on decisions made in the beehive, or this green school, for example. You know, actually that money would be much better left in the pockets of taxpayers, and certainly not at a time when we're borrowing money, printing it, borrowing it, but ultimately it's going to have to be paid back in some form. And what my biggest worry is actually we're going to pay for it through higher inflation in years to come. And that just means that the $50,000 you were being paid next year is only worth 48, 47. And that's what we had in the 70s. And New Zealand and the Western world, and we're running high inflation, was certainly not richer for
it. So now, when I came to economics class, I pretty much doodled my way through. I was basically playing like little video games like Lemonade Stand. That was pretty much the extent. So I'm a bit dull in that area. Can you help explain to me what effectively is inflation, and then how does it affect us in our day-to-day lives as we go along?
Well, I should premise this. I'm not an economist. I like to think surround myself with economists and people much smarter than I am, and I like to think that I hopefully pick up some of it. Inflation is just the general price level that. So, for example, I mean, everyone, you know, that when you were a kid, the bottle of milk was a lot cheaper, you know, but you also know as a kid that what your parents earned was a lot less on average than what it is now. It's the general price level. And what the Reserve Bank does is they have what they call a basket of goods. Now, I'm simplifying, but let's say it's 50 stuff from the supermarket, and how much it is to, you know, petrol's in there and tires and all that sort of thing. And they just literally go and survey it every few months. And that's what's called the, you know, the CPI, Consumer Price Index. And that sort of that the Reserve Bank governor's job is to keep that. This since about 1990 has been to keep that, give or take, between 1% and 3%. It changes slightly over time depending on the government, but roughly there. And I mean, for my professional lifetime, inflation's always been really low, whereas New Zealand has had periods where the general prices have been going up north of 10% per year. Now that means that if you're not getting a pay increase, you're falling behind substantially. And actually, there'll be times where your money's in the bank, and actually just getting whittled away, the actual value, what you can buy with it, is getting whittled away. And what the risk is that we go back to that environment. Now, there's lots of theories as to why that isn't happening already, but I'd argue actually there is a heck of a lot of inflation at the moment, but it's not in the goods and at the supermarket or in services. It's actually in where people are parking their money in stocks and bonds, and obviously property. Come back to the key question. We know we're staring down the barrel of the toughest economic times in our lifetimes, and Auckland house prices are going up.
Now, I think so. I think it was either today. I think it was today when apparently the books were open and the economy is actually doing pretty well. And that was proclaimed quite strongly by our wonderful some of our wonderful leaders. What are your takes? What's your take on that,
Elliot? You need to be subscribing to the good taxpayer union updates. I think.
I need to be.
We had our economist in pre-fu. It's called pre-election fiscal and economic update. And actually, so basically what it is that when the National Party came in 1990 and discovered that the books were a heck of a lot worse than what the public knew, and that the BNZ Bank was about to go belly up and the government were on the hook for it, there were changes to law made under it was actually Ruth Richardson way back in the day that basically was that can never happen again. And a month before the election, it must be 20 working days or something, the Treasury have to publish this document, and the Secretary of the Treasury has to sign off on it, that it gives a fair and accurate representation of the way they see the lay of the world, the books in the government, but also their modelling on GDP going forward, forecasts around government debt, etc. And so that's what happened today. And what we were comparing that with is the equivalent numbers back in May in the budget. If you remember, I think it was the first day we were in level 2. We had the budget, which is the big event where the government decides, here's what we're allocating, but here's what we're spending this year, etc. Now, it's true that where we are today and what we're predicting for the next 12 months is not nearly as bad as it was back in May. But back in May, they were suggesting it was going to be short, sharp, and we're going to be back, and we're going to be okay. Now, it's okay. It's not as dramatic right now, but actually this thing's going to have a very long tail. And they forecast out 15 years, and nowhere in that 15 years does the government bring in more than than's going out. So when I say decade of deficits, it's a decade and a half. It's as far as the eye can see of deficits.
So I'm just going to jump in there quickly. I mean, this is the second time you've sort of brought that up. Are you saying that? I mean, are you saying that the government, under the government, that the governments, successive including or previous governments, are you saying that we are spending more than is incoming? I'm not sure if I'm getting it right or not.
So that's the government, whether it's bringing more in it. So if it brings less in tax and then it spends, that's what we call it's in deficit. Or conversely, if it brings in more than it spends, that's in surplus. I mean, just like, if you spend more than you earn, your bank account's going to go down, or you're going to go into overdraft, or and
it turns a nice red color. And
yeah. So that where we're at is the government is effectively the Treasury, based on Treasury forecasts, we're going to be having about, give or take, $130,000 in government debt per household in about 5 years' time. I mean, another way of putting it, in the time it takes me to say the sentence, the government has spent about $6,500, and it's going to be spending at that rate for the next 3 years. That's the sort of numbers that we're going through. So when we came into this, though, the New Zealand government books were in pretty good shape. I think give or take about 20 grand per household. I mean, quite not too on international scale. It's not too bad. We're actually going to, but we're giving that up. Okay. Admittedly, we started in a position, but as friends much smarter than I mean, I don't know if you've got Oliver Hartwich on here yet, but the chief executive of the New Zealand Initiative think tank. Now, he is a real economist, and he points out that actually, okay, New Zealand's government is in good shape going into this, but overall, the money New Zealand owes to the rest of the world, we're actually bordering on sort of Greece and Italy type territory. But what's unique about New Zealand is that it's not the government that owes it, it's private borrowings, it's households that have borrowed big. And unlike, say, the Japanese, where they owe it to each other, we owe it to the rest of the world. And so the huge risk for New Zealand is that if the government borrows big, okay, the government might not look so worrying, but if you're a trader on Wall Street or you're in London City, and you start to look at, hang on, New Zealand's overall fundamentals, the size of our economy versus how much we owe to the rest of the world, it starts to get very, very worrying. And I think that there is a degree of complacency in Wellington, because we know that we're not looking too bad compared to Britain, for example, and most of the EU, and I think even Australia. We don't look too bad from the government's perspective, but from an overall NZ Inc. perspective, our huge risk is that we get into a debt spiral, and the most worrying would be if our dollar collapsed as a result, because then you just get into a situation where you're unable to pay it back.
And that, I suppose, that's also complicated by the fact that if we're basically in a situation of printing money and you've got other nations who are comparative in some ways also printing money, does that go to your concern around that it looks like it's okay, but really it's a house of cards, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that's a good description. I mean, if the thing is with money is that if printing it worked, Venezuela, Zimbabwe's wouldn't be falling over. You can't just print your money back to print your money to prosperity. The huge irony I find is that during the lockdown, do you familiar with the old political party Social Credit? It was big in the 70s, sort of died in the 80s.
Yeah, they're still around.
They're still around. They did full page ads. And one of the few newspapers I got during the level 4 lockdown, they did full page ads. I can't remember if it, I can't remember which paper it was, but and it was Social Credit. And number one, these guys are still around. What was amazing is that you guys have won. You don't realize it. The whole world is running on Social Credit. You guys haven't clicked. You can pack up. And as Robert Muldoon used to say, and I don't have a lot of time for Robert Muldoon, but he'd say, if funny money works or social credit works, no one else does. And the big fear at the moment is that we're all feeling pretty complacent, and things are going just fine. But are we actually just the coyote that we just run off the cliff and we're about to start falling? And that's the real concern. So let's come back to what are the fundamentals. Yep, the government actually needs to be spending more than it did last year. Very clear. And the government is able to borrow cheaper than putting aside that the Reserve Bank's keeping it very cheap to borrow and is just letting the politicians off the hook. It needs to be. And even your humble taxpayers union have been very public about that. But actually, more than ever, the quality of government spending matters. The cost benefit, making sure it's not wasted, and getting out of the way so New Zealanders can pull our own socks up out of this mess rather than be taxed more or have the government borrow on our behalf for politicians to waltz up and down the nation and giving out, keeping businesses afloat that actually probably aren't going to be around for some years. The obvious one is around these millions that went to the AJ Hackett Bungie, which is just outrageous. That but there's lots of examples of that, and this is the real concern on for the likes of Oliver Hartwich, is actually where we should be supporting businesses through things like the lockdown for short, sharp, but actually keeping what he calls zombies alive, based on political connections or based on their connections to Wellington or the random government grants that are coming out of the beehive and allocating capital like that, actually is a huge handbrake on us reallocating, or the economy as a whole, reallocating resources into this new world for businesses that need to fail, actually failing, sadly to say, and enabling that resources to go to the best use, and improving our economic prosperity in the long term. Because otherwise, we're going to sleepwalk into a New Zealand where we had in the, just before we last, very close to went bust in the 80s, when the band finally stopped playing, and we had all these industries that actually weren't producing. I'm thinking, for example, the most obvious one is farm subsidies for farmers for things that actually Britain used to demand, but we no longer supplied them, as opposed to now when they're actually supplied customers and are directly connected into their markets. Our risk is that we're going to have huge swathes of the economy producing on the basis of what the government wants, rather than what consumers or the rest of the world wants. And that's our big risk.
Now, is that? I mean, that's. I've been less inclined to use this word, but I've used this word more and more over the last 6 months. Actually, is it just me, or does that sound like moving in towards socialism style thinking?
Yeah. Well, that's the fundamental difference that we take probably to the current government. We would argue that yes, we need stimulus. Our traditional method of stimulus is when the Reserve Bank making money a bit cheaper, cutting the official cash rate or reducing interest rates, meaning that businesses that wanted to invest are now able to afford to, meaning that householders have a little bit more income because they don't have to pay as much for the mortgage. That's broken because interest rates are close to zero. So instead, the Reserve Bank's printing money. So that sort of whole mechanism is sort of stuffed up. So what we're saying is, okay, role for government is to stimulate the economy. And there's two ways you can do that. You can reduce the tax burden, or you can spend money. And basically, the current government are choosing the latter at all possible opportunities. And it's doing that in ways that are hugely distortionary. That the something like the wage subsidy, at least, wasn't the model that we would have picked for it. It applied equally, and it was overall, I think, pretty reasonable in the circumstances of literally telling everyone to go home and lock your doors. Whereas what the government's now going into is, instead of sort of pan industry, it's sort of who's up next. Here's the tourism minister, and tourism is very important. Here's a swathe of money that individual businesses can come and do grants. Here's New Zealand's the obvious one because it's seen as our national airline, but I'd use the example of like Intercity. They turn up, they're strategic. We need that.
Yeah.
Quite literally, a couple of weeks ago, there was a grant about, I think it was 23 bus companies, tour companies, and these were somehow the strategic ones. So if you ran the other one, sorry, pal, you missed out. But this idea, this allocation of capital based on, it'd be bad enough if it was officials in the Ministry of Economic MBET, Ministry of Business, Innovation and
MBA,
Employment.
yeah.
But it's even worse than that. In some instances, like that green school, it's actually literally ministers sitting down with the individual applications, going through it. Now, New Zealand has had a tradition that pretty much ended when New Zealand first got that provincial growth boat, whatever, growth fund.
And not a slush fund.
Not a slush, of course not. Of course not. That actually the politicians' role, since we got rid of all this stuff under Longy, was the politicians set the criteria or the rules or the boundaries and leave it to officials. And actually, there's a lot of things we don't, in corporate welfare, there's a lot of areas where that just runs amok. It's bad. But even worse than that is when you're letting the politicians do it. And that, unfortunately, is where we are at the moment.
I have to say, it's. I mean, you're factual, and you're being very much the way in which you're speaking. Man, there's a really concerning way where there is a strong. I think we can all sort of say that we're talking about deeply. We're talking about nepotism, anywhere between nepotism and just straight out corruption. At least that's from my point of view.
There's a couple of instances where I am aware of corruption in New Zealand, and it wouldn't surprise anyone who they were and what it related to. But very defamatory, and that's not a challenge I wish to bear again in my lifetime. But
yep.
that in fact, New Zealand there's very little corruption in New Zealand, and I use the term soft corruption. That it's not one of the great things about New Zealand is everyone knows each other, but that's also a real problem in this, because and this is the problem. This is the issue that I see more and more in Wellington, of just relationships and who's able to call who. I mean, the arbitrariness of the rules during the lockdown show that some firms had exemptions, some didn't. That I'll give you a very small example that affected us. Under level 3, not in Auckland, the second one, but the first one, there was all sorts of little carve-outs in the regulations, and one of them was that unions were allowed to travel interregionally for work. Now, I think they meant trade unions, and that was a result of the Council of Trade Unions being very friendly with the relevant ministers that were putting that together. But of course, running a union, and I needed to get to Wellington for the budget, and very fortunately, I did take advantage of that right on the last day of level 3. But one, it's a drafting error, but 2, that's a classic example. Because, I'm sorry, but unions did not need to be traveling between regions in the same way as courier drivers or truck drivers, rather. But somehow that was snuck in. Because because Mr. Trade Unionist head knew that this was that's just wrong. And all this unfortunately that is now happening based on industries, that specific industries based on their connections into government, based on their political clout, are getting more looked after than others. And that is, we're seeing whole swathes of New Zealand business industries now that for a generation have been solely focused on the customer, and now shifting their orbit towards Wellington. And that's what drove us from one of, if not the richest country in the world in the early 20th century, it was either us or Argentina, to quite a poor country relative to Australia and a lot of the Western world by the 70s and early 80s. And I really worry that we're seeing that again, and that gap between us and Australia is again going to increase. And so our argument would be that rather than focusing on the spending, is actually, yes, stimulate the economy, but stimulate the economy by getting out of the way. And there's lots of talk. We can talk about regulatory taxes and RMA and things like that, but actually even our preferred method is to do what the British did, or the UK did rather, after the global financial crisis, and that is a temporary cut to GST, or for them it's VAT, but us it's GST. Same thing, basically the same thing.
Yeah.
And that would, basically, if we decrease that from 15% down to 10 or 5, it would be an immediate increase to every New Zealander's incomes. It would disproportionately advantage people that, the less well off, that spend all their income rather than save. And it would also incentivize, because it would be time limited, it would do very similar to what a normal cut in an interest rate would do, because it would bring forward future spending, because you'd have an incentive to spend now before GST went back up. So that we would, and the other thing is it doesn't favour any particular industry. It keeps the choice into consumers. It means that the people listening at this at home, that they are picking how they spend their money, and not the bureaucrats or the politicians in Wellington.
That is incredible. That is incredible. Look, just for our,
I should say one thing before I criticise but it would mean we borrow more. Yes, it would.
Yeah.
But it would be better than borrowing for that. Would be better than the government spending it, because you actually get additional costs and what are called debt, like losses in relation to tax. But two is you make it temporary, so you don't bake in the deficit spending going forward, and that's a really key point.
Absolutely. I'm just having a look through the comments. It looks like people are loving what you're saying. Thank you so much for your comments, everyone. Now, firstly, man, as soon as this comes down, please go to Taxpayers Union website and subscribe. I'm subscribed on there, and I can tell you, from someone who doodled a lot when he was in accounting and economics, I understand what they're saying. And this is actually one of the great things about the Taxpayers Union, is they're able to put things forward. They're able to explain and articulate things that are actually complicated issues and discussions around Reserve Bank, RMA, various tax upon taxes, and all of the various mechanisms that occur. And they can put it in a really great way. And I have to say, Jordan, that you and your team are amazing. You've got is it Louis? I can't remember him, but you've got a couple of people on your team, and they're so great at being able to explain more complicated things.
It's all them. I'm surrounded by these wonderful young people. I'm 34, and I'm a bit of an old bugger on the staff. But
you're old bugger, yeah. Thanks.
These incredibly intelligent young people that a lot of them have come through our internship program, but are on staff. And yeah, I mean the plug is, if you'd want to receive our once a week, generally the updates, unless there's something breaking news, taxpayers.org.nz. We're like any good political organisation. We'll occasionally ask you for money. You don't have to give it. But as you know, Elliot, you can't save the world if you can't keep the lights on. And
that's right.
That's unlike all our opponents. That there's not. We're not asking for the special favours from the government.
And I have to say, look, yeah, taxpayers.org.nz. Really, just jump in there and subscribe straight away. I can absolutely attest to what the team there do. They really do. And also, they got crack-up memes half the time. They really do got crack-up memes. That'd be hilarious. And there's also this cool thing. There's also this really cool thing where they have the pig. Oh gosh, what's it called? The Piggy Awards or something like that.
Oh, you're thinking that no, Porky is our lovable mascot. Porky's a waste hater. But occasionally he gate crashes government agencies and goes and hands out awards for wasting money. No, I think you're thinking of our Jonesies, which are our premier, named after the Honourable Shane Jones, the inaugural Lifetime Achievement winner. And they celebrate the very best of the worst of government waste in a red carpet awards, Oscar-style award ceremony, where we literally give away golden pigs to the politicians and officials. who have wasted money in the most ridiculous ways in the previous 12 months. So if you Google the Jonesies Taxpayers Union, you'll see the video of there. And I didn't host it this year. It was down to Isla and Louis, but we have a ball. And let me tell you that the Beehive staff tell me that they are all watching it on the live stream. So clearly we're making a difference. It's the award the politicians do not want to receive.
I have to say, I've watched the last 2 years, only last 2 years, but I loved them. I thought they're awesome, and it's so cracker because just for you out there, if you're watching, have a look at the Jonesies. It's great, and it's pretty awkward too. There are some times there where it's been hit, and it's so awkward as in the room they're doing it at. So it really is the whole you don't want this award, but there's some wonderful ones. We've actually stuck them up.
Yeah, you guys are, I mean, your social media, New Conservative social media is excellent. And I think, though, Elliot, it's a big part of what makes you very good at this sort of thing is that you're actually having fun. And that's a key, that's a key thing that often, we've got to remember on the centre right. I mean, I look at it that the role of the Taxpayers Union is a little bit like the way Greenpeace are out there to spread a message. Obviously not on the same message, but, they don't get up in the morning to put on a polar bear costume. We don't get up, our interns don't get up in the morning to put on Porky the Waste Hater costume. That may or may not be a costume. But ultimately, our objective is to remind people of this radical idea that you spend your money better than politicians and bureaucrats. And if the staff have to go after the ridiculous examples rather than the ones that are really hard to conceptualize because it's millions or sometimes billions of dollars, that's okay, because in the same way as I say, Greenpeace go and do the stunts to make their point, I'm not ashamed to have set up an organisation that does the same thing. And we've got to, of course, balance it, get the balance right between the big things that really matter and the emotive sort of smaller stuff. But ultimately, it's the same objective. And we're very fortunate that tens of thousands of New Zealanders have come on board and said, I'm not getting this elsewhere. The great sad thing about the Taxpayers Union is we don't have very much competition, unlike the left, where there's all sorts of organisations. There's probably a society for the protection of the albino snail, but there's not so many on it. So I like, whenever I call a New Conservative politician or a National Party MP or David Seymour, I always start the call with it's your militant unionist speaking, because the Labour Party have all these unions and organisations with this undue influence on them. And I mean, we certainly don't have any of that with the National Party or any other party for that matter. But I'm not ashamed to say, we are on the centre right and economically. We don't take a view. We attract the sort of hardcore libertarians like Damien Grant and who writes in the Sunday Star Times. We also attract the conservative voices, many of which are members and supporters of yours, and I think that's a good thing.
Yep, absolutely. Look, now we have gone so far over time, it's not even funny, but I'm so glad, and just I've been seeing how people are responding, and it's just wonderful. It's really powerful. So I just want to, what is one message? Just what would you say to the people of New Zealand in this current age? What is one message that you at least want to give up? Now, I just want to plug again, Taxpayers Union, please sign up, subscribe. If you've got a bit of extra bling, give them an extra bling. These guys are doing such good work in terms of exposing things that you would never hear about, and you'll be finding a great deal of surprises when you look through what they have discovered. So please, I really recommend that you guys jump in there and subscribe hard. But so, Jordan, what's one final message that you just want to send to all of our New Zealanders who are out there? Take it away.
Yeah, I think
and have
this one will surprise you, I think, because it's not going to be on tax or even government spending. I want to come back to the point I made right at the beginning. We are really well served by not having the sort of polarization that the US and even I see a lot more in Australia. And I think that that we should often pause, and I see this a lot in the something that you've poured a heck of a lot of unworthy praise on me tonight. Elliot, I should say that your work around free speech has been second to none, and quite honestly. So I do think, and I see this across many parties, when you're in the heat of a campaign, you can often project or ascribe evil motive or wrong motive on our political opponents. And the left do that to us all the time. But we should rise above it. We should not, one of the things that, one of the mantras at the Taxpayers Union that I teach the staff is, and we don't always get it right, but we strive to be fun, not nasty. And you'll see on our memes, they take the proverbial, they take the mickey, but well, I get my heckles up if the nastiness there of calling Jacinda names and things like that. So that would be my message, because as a conservative movement, we should make sure we don't. It's very, they do it to us, but we should always strive not to do it back, because New Zealand is so well served by not having this sort of polarization, political divide. We should be able to go and deal with them afterwards. That's my point.
Absolutely, Jordan Williams, you and your team are amazing. You have done such great things for this nation, and I say that as a patriot as well as a conservative. So I thank you. I thank your team, and I know that people are already absolutely just having a wonderful time. They're going to be sharing this and going that. So thank you so much for your time tonight. I really do appreciate it, and we'll catch up with you real soon.
Thanks, Elliot. Cheers.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for cluing in. We've got more wonderful people coming up. That was amazing. That went really over time, and I'm so glad that it did, because it's just a wonderful to get experts in the field like Jordan and his people. He's an amazing man, and he's a family man. And I'm sure he's going to be looking after his daughter when she wakes up crying for some milk or something like that. So, in the meantime, we're here. We're going to gun harder and harder. We're here to make sure that democracy is protected and defended, that families are strengthened, and that we are always here ready to protect our very nation from those who are attempting to take it away from us. So God bless you, and God bless New Zealand.